Fighting games, although a niche genre, has been around for quite some time. A lot of people shy away from them, however, because they may seem too difficult to get into. This is why I have decided to make this guide to the best of my ability, to help as many of you newer players out there as possible. The video will be divided into 3 parts. I will be talking about simple button notations and character types for the beginner section, gameplay mechanics for the intermediate section, and combo structure for the expert section of the video. I'll also give some advice and tips as to how I personally handle these kinds of things at the end of each section. Please note going forward though, that fighting games are indeed hard. I'd be lying if I said you wouldn't have a lot of walls, failure and salt moments ahead of you. However, I'd like to encourage you. I have been playing them for merely 2 years, so I know how information is annoyingly scarce and scattered. I tried my best to put everything in one place to help you newer players out there, so please give it your best shot and let's get started. Let's hit this off with some information about what types of controllers you can use to play fighting games. Standard console controllers, arcade sticks, and their variations can all play fighting games. Whichever you use does not necessarily matter, what matters is that you are comfortable using them. From then on, practice handles the rest. With so many controllers though, it can be quite confusing when you see a lot of different types of buttons. Especially when someone who uses a different kind of controller is trying to teach a newbie. That's why the FGC has a very easy way of dealing with this issue. There are 2 types of FGC button notations. They are the standard notation and the numpad notation. Let's assume you're holding a standard console controller like the 2 represented on screen, an Xbox or a PS4 controller. As far as the directional buttons go, or the D-pad goes, forward would be F, down would be D, B would be back, and U would be up. These are fairly similar across the board for all the controllers, but when it comes to their actual buttons, things might be a little bit difficult. For the Xbox controller, 1 will be mapped to X, 2 will be mapped to Y, 3 will be mapped to A, and 4 will be mapped to B. And for the PS4 controller, 1 will be mapped to square, 2 will be mapped to triangle, 3 will be mapped to X, and 4 will be mapped to circle. These are fairly similar as well. No matter what controller you're holding, you know where 1 will always be, same for 2, 3, and 4. No matter which controller you're using, could be a Switch controller, could be a PS4 or an Xbox controller, as long as they have the standard layout for these buttons, the numbers are always going to be the same button in the same order. The numpad notation requires slightly a bit more explanation. If you are to look at the numpad of the keyboard, you can see that the numbers are represented alongside arrows. Each number along with its arrow is to represent a direction. This means that the directions using the numpad notation would be 5 for neutral, which means you're not doing anything, 6 for forward, 4 for back, 8 for up, and 2 for down. And the buttons would be shown depending on the game you play. An example would be Street Fighter. And this game has light punch being LP, medium punch being MP, and heavy punch being HP. And the same scheme is the same for the kicks being light kick, medium kick, and heavy kick. Other games have their own schemes like P, K, S, and HS for Guilty Gear, and L, M, and H, and S for Dragon Ball. This isn't always defined though, and can change a lot depending on the game you play, with it being a better method specifically in only very small cases. The most static notation is the standard, and this is why for the remainder of the video I will explain everything using only the standard notation. I find it way easier than the numpad notation. Input motions rely on the type of notation being used, and as I have said before, I will use the standard notation for the rest of the video. Input motions are a little different from standalone motions like forward, down, back, and up. As the name suggests, they are motions and therefore have a starting and an ending point. In this section, I'd like to go over the specifics of some input jargon in fighting games. You can practice these right now, or always feel free to return to this point in the video as I go over them and how they are performed. The most basic thing you might hear when it comes to these are QCF and QCB. Now, what do these mean? They are simply quarter circle forward and quarter circle backward. Let me explain further. With the standard notation, directional button input movements are expressed by circular movements. Look at the circle for example. A quarter of the circle is the shaded area in this picture. This means that the starting point will be down and the end point will be forward. For another example, a half circle is represented by the shaded area in this circle. Based on this, if someone said to do the input quarter circle forward, you would place your hand on the down button and slide it towards the forward button. The jargon for this is called a fireball motion. The name originates from older Street Fighter games, where this motion was reused Hadouken. This can be applied to QCB or quarter circle backward, whereas the jargon is called Tatsu, relative to the side you are on in game. So if someone said HCF, we know this would mean half circle forward, and that the input starting point is from back, slides to the down button, and then to the forward button. There are some inputs that require a neutral stance from a button initially being pressed before executing a QCF or fireball motion. This is represented by F, QCF. The jargon for this is called a dragon punch or a DP. To do this, tap forward once, and quickly follow that with a fireball motion. The neutral is this state right here, where for a brief moment you don't do anything after tapping forward. A little more on DP is that they are invincible on the first frame of action. This can also be called an iframe, standing for invincibility frame. This means that at the start of the move, you cannot be hit by anything. This input also originates from Street Fighter, where Ryu and Ken had a move called the Shoryuken, or the Dragon Punch, hence the name DP. I'll explain more about frames later. Okay, here's my specific tip for this. Personally, I had a lot of problems with my thumb sliding across the D-pad when I tried this. It is far easier for me to do now, but my solution was using a thin piece of cloth or my shirt over my thumb. It could be a handkerchief as well, whatever works for you. Moving my thumb across the D-pad felt so much smoother for me like this, so I kept doing it, and I do it even today. Now I'd like to talk about some character archetypes. The reason for this is that some characters are indeed better at teaching you fighting games than others, because of how simple but effective they are at many aspects of the game's core. Please note that these will be specifically for traditional fighting games like Street Fighter and most other 2D fighting games. For games like Tekken, I can go over those in another video. So, for these character archetypes, we have the Shotos. These are the rather basic characters with strong emphasis at fundamentals of the game, such as Ryu from Street Fighter. Note that these characters always have a basic fireball and DP, which is also an anti-air. These are characters that I'd recommend starting fighters with, especially when they are obvious, but they aren't a must. They will simply help you learn the game's main fundamentals, and those last forever, but gimmicks don't. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about grapplers. These are the often slower and lacking in range characters that usually have extremely high damage so long as they can simply get close enough to grab you. They can be quite difficult and require proper spacing understanding in games to play them well. It's an archetype I don't recommend starting with. An example of these characters, however, are Zangief from Street Fighter, Iron Taker from BlazBlue, and Potemkin from Guilty Gear. Rushdown characters. These are characters that always want to make sure that you are doing nothing but blocking. And the second you make a mistake by getting impatient, you can get hit for a poke or a lot of damage. They are usually quite fast and seek to always close the range between you and them as much as possible, where they constantly frustrate you with insane aggression. A good example of this is Dudley from Street Fighter and Yamcha from Dragon Ball FighterZ. Boy oh boy, we have zoners. These are the characters that constantly keep you far away from them whilst harassing you with constant projectiles. They excel naturally at the long range, but once you get close to them, they won't always be a problem. This is one of the most salt-inducing archetypes and troubles for newer players. Examples are Scarlet from Mortal Kombat 11 and Metera from Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. On to the charge characters. These are characters that are actually usually very defensive. They are characterized by their special move that require you to have an input held down for an amount of time before it can be executed. Because of this charge system, the most basic of their special moves are actually more powerful or beneficial than characters that have basic inputs. Please note that this is not always the case though. Examples of this character archetype are Guile from Street Fighter and Charlotta from Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. Each and every fighting game has its own set of rules and mechanics that make them similar at their core but different when it comes to depth. Some of these universal mechanics include Super Dashes and Vanishes from Dragon Ball FighterZ, Rage Out and Rage Drives from Tekken 7, and Super Bars and Super Meters from Street Fighter, which is actually quite the popular universal mechanic. Footsies are the absolute core of fighting games. They refer to the many gameplay situations you are in, when you and your opponent constantly try to hit each other just at the maximum range of each other's attacks, to fish for pokes and counter hits from the neutral position. Try to watch your opponents carefully and take note of their attack ranges. This is what is so popularly known as playing the neutral game. Do note that fishing is basically trying to get a hit on your opponent, and pokes are attacks that are thrown out for the main purpose of chipping away at your opponent's health. This neutral position is basically when both you and your opponent are standing still at which any of you can perform an action. Footsies are so important that there is a fighting game literally called Footsies made for the purpose of practice of this very technique. In fact, there are even tournaments held around this and they can be quite entertaining. Mastering footsies are indeed a pivotal part to fighting games, and they will help you improve a lot in fighting games. In the neutral position, both characters are considered to be at 0 frames. I will explain this next, so just relax. I'm pretty sure you guys have heard about taking turns in fighting games, right? Well, the truth is, unlike RPG games, it's not about letting your opponent attack before you do. Instead, turns refer to a situation where it is more advantageous for you to attack your opponent and when you probably shouldn't. Frames are 1/60th of a second, and the measurement for them is noted by the letter I, with X being the number. An example would be 3 frames, simply written as I3. When the frame of an action in a fighting game is smaller, it means it's faster, so a move that is 20 frames is far slower than a move that is 10 frames. Back onto the topic of turns though, the frames that are the most important are startup frames, which is the time it takes for your move to come out, and the frame advantage, which is how long it takes for your character performing the attack to return to the neutral position. There are 3 main scenarios for these instances, which is the safe or plus scenario, the unsafe or minus scenario, and the 0 or neutral scenario. Note that if your frame advantage for the safe scenario is equivalent to or greater than 1, this means that you recover before your opponent does by the respective frame number. For scenario 2, which is the unsafe scenario, if your frame advantage is less than or equivalent to -1, this means that your opponent will recover before you by the respective frame number. Again, please note that the third scenario being 0 just means that both characters are in the neutral position. Frame advantage really comes to importance when you are blocking your opponent's attacks, but before that, we are going to talk about mix-ups and what they mean for you in a block situation. Usually, when you are blocking in a fighting game, you aren't completely safe. In fact, whilst blocking, you need to be far more on your toes than when you are on the offensive. The reason being that, when you are blocking, the opponent has the opportunity to open you up through a mix-up. This is because in fighting games there are two main block positions. They are standing and crouching positions. If you stand block, you will successfully defend against moves that have the hit property of being highs, mids and overheads. However, if your opponent attacks you with a low hitting attack, you will fail to defend and be opened up to damage. If you crouch block, you will successfully defend against low hitting attacks, however, you will be hit by high or overhead attacks. The situation in which you are going to have to guess if your enemy is going to hit you with either a overhead attack or a low attack is referred to as a mix-up. Back to frame advantage, if you defend an attack thrown out by your opponent, you are put in a block stun. This is the short period of time that you take to recover from a successfully blocked attack from your opponent. When this happens, your opponent will be either plus or minus or neutral depending on the same scenarios that we talked about above. When the enemy is minus after you block, this means that it is your turn. In this situation, you can punish your opponent. Punishes happen on two occasions. They happen when you block an unsafe move or when an enemy whiffs or misses an attack. If you manage to hit your enemy whilst they are in that state of recovery, this is called a punish, and specifically called a whiff punish if they missed an attack. It is very important to mention that just because your opponent is plus after an attack doesn't mean there isn't any ways to still counter them. Just because they are minus doesn't mean it's always going to be your turn either. This is why saying stealing turns is a thing, because even though it's not your turn, you can still do something sometimes to make it your turn. So just keep that in mind. So, congratulations. You pretty much know all the basics of fighting games. Now, you're going to want to move past your button mashing and begin styling on your opponent. Well, sit tight. The next section is for you.
Bring it on!
Combos can be quite flashy and pretty fun to do, but they may seem very difficult. So, I will go ahead and explain what they are and how exactly they work, along with how execution plays a heavy role going forward. I will first be explaining what cancels are. Cancels are simply interruptions. You see, fighting games function heavily on this interruption system. When a move is being performed, it can be cancelled into another move. It completely stops the recovery frame of the action performed and starts the next action immediately. The rules of the system changes depending on the fighting game, but the simplest form that it exists in all of them are strings or links. An example is L into M into H for anime fighters. And specifically because anime fighters have some of the flashiest combos, I will specifically be using them for the next section's explanation. Cancels can be further broken down into special cancels. This happens when the link is not just for another normal hit command, but for one of the special moves that your character can perform. A good example of this is Goku's heavy into a fireball. If you remember, we talked about fireball motions before. This simply means to do this combo, we press H and quarter circle forward S. This is as basic as a special cancel combo can be, but there are many ways depending on the game to extend combos. These ways are their combo structures. Every game has the specific combo structure it can follow. They also have specific ways of scaling damage and preventing you from comboing people infinitely. But because we are only talking about a more traditional anime fighter, we will talk about Dragon Ball FighterZ, with some characters in particular having slightly varied combo structures. If you'd like a more detailed explanation on a different game's combo structure, feel free to request it of me in the comments. We will be using a basic Shoto character from Dragon Ball FighterZ like Adult Gohan. He has a Fireball and a DP, and follows all the fundamental rules of Dragon Ball FighterZ. This means he can teach us the most core fundamentals of the game just by learning how to play him. A basic combo structure would be a starter into a jump cancel, that is simply cancelling into a forward jump, launching the opponent higher and knocking them back to the ground. Now, if we talk about execution of this combo structure, your execution would be referred to as how many times you can reliably pull off this combo. If you can consistently pull off the same combo reliably and convert combos of different kinds of hits, that is changing a minor hit into a damaging combo, that would mean you have good execution. Execution improvement happens with time and repetitive action, so remember to never drop that controller and keep at your practice. If you made it to the end of the video, I'd like to thank you for watching this guide, and I hope you're able to learn something new today. This has been a work in progress for quite a bit, and I do appreciate everyone for sticking around and watching it. I hope that more and more people get into fighting games, so that I can have a lot more memories with everyone that I end up playing with. So please do consider dropping a like if you liked everything. Drop a subscription if you believe I deserve it, and if you have anything that you particularly didn't understand in the guide, please do ask me in the comment sections below. I will be sure to check and answer it if possible. And once again, thank you for making it to the end of the video. I really appreciate you guys. All the best.